Okay, so today I want to talk about having a dog in Merida, Mexico. The differences between here versus, let's say, the US on how to take care of your dog. I mean, at the end of the day, honestly, it's the same thing. Merida loves their dogs. We have a Petco. We have tons of other local stores that cater to pets. So whatever it is you want when it comes to your dog or your cat, I'm very confident you can find it here. One of my earliest concerns was whether I would be able to find the dog food that my dog loves. Do you hear all those birds? I'm in Bepensa Park, by the way. Highly recommend, very dog friendly. And so when it comes to dog food, you can find the same brands that you have in the US. Maybe not literally every brand, right? I do not know, but like my brand that I used was Pedigree, so that was super easy to find. Walmart sells them, as well as, of course, the specialty stores. And as expected, right, the cost of taking care of your dog here is so much less than the US. I used to dread taking my dog to the vet because the cost of taking care of the dog, I just felt like I was always shelling out at least $50, like a $50 visit was in my mind a cheap visit in the US, but probably I was shelling out closer to $100 a visit, right? So it's definitely cost effective to have a dog here, again, especially if I'm comparing it to the US. Same for dog grooming in the US. Again, I was probably paying $75 to $100 for my dog to have a bath, to get his nails cut, to get his teeth brushed, all that jazz. Here, my most recent one cost me a little over 300 pesos. It's in the $15 category, guys. Like, same quality, absolutely perfect. So cost-wise, absolutely love it. However, the things that I find a little bit different here are things like it's freaking hot. So right now it is late March, almost April, and we are in the hundreds. It's literally just too hot for Henry right now. I noticed this when taking him to the groomers. My groomer is less than a 10-minute walk. I think honestly, probably closer to 5 minutes away from my house, so we generally walk there. But right now it is so hot that Henry cannot walk the entire way to the groomers. He literally stops maybe like a minute away from the vet. There's a patch of grass and some trees, and Henry will literally just plop down and just, he's like, I'm done with the heat, I'm done with the walk, thank you so much, talk to me later. That being said, Henry is a very, very small dog, and so if your dog is much larger, he or she may be able to handle the heat a lot better than my Yorkie poo, so give it a try. Definitely bring water, and this actually applies in the winter. When we first got here, it was the end of November, but it was still hot, like we were still dying. So just remember, everywhere you take your dog, you're probably gonna wanna bring a bowl for water and, of course, a little doggy bag to handle incidents. When I first got here, I did have a few people tell me that it's common not to pick up after your dogs. And while, listen, the lazy in me absolutely wants to not pick up after my dog, I am not a fan of touching other people's poop. It's not really my thing. However, I will tell you that having talked to the locals, they are absolutely super appreciative of the fact that I pick up after my dogs. Nobody likes having dog poop on the streets or in the playgrounds, so just keep that in mind. While there are some people that may not, when you get to know the locals, a decent amount of them really do appreciate that we pick up after the dogs, as you would in the US. Something else to keep in mind is, just like the US, you have mixed feelings and emotions when it comes to dogs here in Mexico. Some people absolutely love all dogs, but there are people here, just as in the US, who are not huge fans of dogs. So when it comes to walking your dog, just as you would in the US, make sure that you don't let your dog jump on people. Again, it boggles my mind sometimes a little bit because Henry is such a small dog. He's so little, he literally couldn't hurt anyone. But when you don't like dogs, you don't like any size of dogs. So even if you've got a small dog, we do need to make sure to keep our dog on a leash and or train them enough to where they're not jumping on people, because a lot of people don't like it. Henry has had zero problems getting into Ubers. However, I've received like wary looks where the driver is kind of like, I don't really want a dog in my car. And then I've had others that specifically asked me, can you make sure your dog stays on your lap? So of course, I'm as careful as I possibly can be, keeping Henry on my lap and not letting him touch things. Generally though, Uber drivers have been super supportive of Henry being in the car. I know a lot of people have been intimidated by taking an Uber with their dog. I don't think I've heard of anyone actually being refused, but plan to have your dog on your lap, possibly even if it's a big dog. One of the negatives of having a dog in Merida, in my opinion, is that they cannot go on buses. Some of the larger buses will allow the dog to go in cargo, but as hot as it gets here in Merida, I just don't recommend it. There's no air conditioning or any kind of protection for your dog as they're in the cargo. They're just going to kind of scooch around however the bus moves. So in essence, if you want to transport your dog, you are limited to taking a flight and using whatever rules the airline has, or finding a private driver. This is assuming, of course, that you do not bring your own car. I believe I've heard of very few cases where somebody with a large dog was denied, the Uber ride, but they were able to get another one. We're talking about one dog. Once you've got 2, 3, 4, multiple numbers, might get much, much more difficult. And that's where I think hiring a private driver might be the wisest thing to do. Speaking of private drivers, I have put the links to a private driver below. Generally, anytime I'm hiring a private driver, I check out multiple. And so the more you can collect, the better. That way you can get different options of prices, etc. But if you've got a pet, sometime in your life, you're gonna probably want a private driver. With the exception of a pet-related store such as Petco or the groomers, Henry has not gone inside of any store. However, I have seen people take their small, well-trained dogs to places like the slow food market, which definitely caters to a much more touristy clientele, as opposed to, let's say, Lucas de Galvez Mercado, where I have never seen a dog, and I really would imagine they would not be welcome there. Now, when it comes to restaurants, a lot of places now, more than ever, although honestly, I think we've had a lot of outdoor restaurant places here in Merida. Henry and other dogs have been welcome to any outdoor location, right? So if they have outdoor seating, Henry is generally authorized. I will say that while I lean very liberal when it comes to having pets at restaurants, just keep in mind that, again, similar to the US, there are people at that restaurant who perhaps are not huge dog lovers, or maybe they're just grossed out by the idea of a dog being near their food, right? And so you want to make sure to only do this really if you've got a very well-trained dog. Henry, I'm going to say, is not a well-trained dog. While I have been super lucky the very few times that I've taken him to a restaurant, meaning he's not required any tidying up and he's not bothered other patrons directly, I always make sure to sit on the outermost part of the outside area so that Henry can be just the least intrusive. And again, these are also places where you want to bring some kind of a dog bowl or something so that your pet can enjoy something to drink, something to eat as well. And in terms of the doctors, they have what seems to be the same requirements in the US. When I first took him to Petco, they required his vaccine information just as you would in the US, right? When you go to a new groomer, they just want to make sure that your dog is fully vaccinated. So expect the same thing here. They seem to have all of the other meds like heartworm medication and such. But I would imagine, just as for you, right? When you're looking into whether the doctors have the things that you might need for your particular medical situation, if your dog happens to have a very particular situation where you need, a special medication, I would highly recommend contacting a local vet just to make sure that that item is available here, because I would hate to come here and find out that medication either for yourself, your child, or your pet is simply unavailable, especially when you can possibly get it easier in the States and bring it with you. So just as for us, taking care of your dog or your pet is relatively easy. It's much more cost effective than in the US, but there's always exceptions to the rule. So if you have a particular question, make sure to ask. So the apartment that I'm currently in does not have outdoor space. I don't have a backyard, I don't have like a patio, nothing. So I do have to take my dog fully outside when he needs to go. And something I have to be super vigilant, especially now that winter is over, it means that I have to walk my dog around 7 in the morning and 7 at night. If I plan on walking Henry any length of time, really before 7 a.m. or after 7 a.m. are the ideal times. If I attempt to walk him at noon, I'm not saying it's impossible, but one, I don't want to be outside of that kind of heat. I certainly don't want to run in that kind of heat. And Henry is a runner. And two, I've noticed that Henry doesn't really want to be outside for very long either. So he's panting more. I'm noticing that he wants to hang out on every patch of green that he finds. He's wanting to find shade. And so I can tell that my dog is also suffering from this heat, which is why before 7 in the morning or after 7 at night is when he gets his long walks. I do, of course, during the day take him out for breaks because he needs his little breaks, but we literally go outside just so he can relieve himself, and then we come right back in. Bepensa, by the way, also has a cafeteria. I don't think you can see it. It's on the other side of the park. They've got a cafeteria where they've got just the best local foods, as well as hamburgers, hot dogs, and pizza if your kid happens to prefer those types of items. And they are super, super affordable. and delicious. Highly recommend this place. If you come here, you have to go there. And speaking of the heat, you absolutely have to try the Pina con chaya, which is an aguas frescas. It's a very cool and refreshing beverage that you will learn to appreciate very quickly here in Merida. And so while right now Henry tends not to get out of the house too often, places that Henry has enjoyed is Bepensa Park. When we first come to a place like Bepensa, I do generally let him off leash for a little bit. I say off leash, I actually let go of the leash because I have this fear that I will never catch my dog if he's completely off leash. Because as you can expect, he gets super excited when I first release him. And so I do let him run. I do try to make sure that we're not close to other kids, other people, because once again, there are lots of people who just are not fans of dogs. But when I bring Henry, I also want him to enjoy the park and to release some of his pent-up energy. And so I absolutely let him run. I usually, again, I take him to an area of the park where there aren't any other people, and then I just let him run free just for a little bit so he can enjoy and get some of that energy out. But combination of the fact that we honestly don't do it very often, slash it's freaking hot here, Henry doesn't last too long running freely, and at some point he comes back to me panting, ready for a break, at which point he generally stays on the leash the entire rest of the time. We do go to the restaurant where there's a shaded area, and then I make sure Henry gets his water while I enjoy the yumminess of the restaurant. Another favorite place for us to go is the ecological park, but unfortunately ever since last June, I say again last June, it is now March, almost April, that location has been flooded. So we can still go there, but it's just much less land than it used to be. There's a lot less locations that Henry can roam. Also, I believe last time I checked, the playground itself was roped off to where they didn't allow people to play on the playground. And so if we can't go on the playground and there's really not much land anymore for the dog to run, kind of defeats the purpose of our going there. But I am told that between April and May, when it gets super hot, that any place that is flooded tends to no longer be flooded. It should go down. So hopefully soon we'll be able to go back to that park. The Parque Alta Brisa, which is very close to the Alta Brisa Mall, also has a little dog exercise area, but just know it's not fully enclosed. So if your dog is the type to want to jump up and run, he absolutely can. It's partially fenced, but for the most part, it's not. Your dog can absolutely leave. So it is really important, I think, here, if you've got a pet, to train your dog as best you can on, at a minimum, just listening to you. When you call your dog, make sure your dog does come back to you, because most of the parks here are relatively close to streets. You wouldn't want your dog running and getting run over. And then again, every park has people in it. And so if your dog happens to find somebody who is not a fan of dogs, you're going to want to be able to control your dog very quickly so that we don't impede on the day for somebody who maybe is terrified of dogs or simply just doesn't want to be bothered with your pet. Now, when it comes to getting an Airbnb, I find that most Airbnb hosts generally say that they won't accept a pet because they're afraid of three things. One, they're afraid that the pet might destroy the house in some way. They don't want dogs peeing on the floor. They don't want cats scratching the furniture. Two, the noise considerations, right? A lot of Airbnb owners get a lot of slack from their neighbors because the neighbors don't want to deal with rude visitors or dogs that are barking all the time. And so sometimes they say that they don't want pets because they don't want loud barking dogs. And then of course, last but not least, they might say they don't want a pet because maybe they're allergic and they don't want that particular pet dander to be in their home. So I find that when looking for an Airbnb, the first time I look for Airbnbs, I do put the filter on of pets authorized. But if I don't find a place that I like that says pets are authorized, I take that filter off and then I message the owner saying, hey, I've got a really small dog. He is hypoallergenic. He doesn't bark. He's trained to where he will wait to go outside before he relieves himself. And I've only had one person that basically told me, no matter what, we're not letting a dog in our house, but the others have been very lenient. So just keep that in mind, that if you're not finding an Airbnb that allows pets, maybe just talk to the owner and let them know your particular situation and see if they're willing to budge. I will note that I've also never been asked to pay an additional deposit because of the dog. So that's a plus. So I wanted to come on here and add that, to my knowledge, I don't believe there are any leash laws here in Merida. I believe you are allowed to let your dog off its leash and do what it wants. As a general rule, I find strays don't really bother us, although every once in a while we do find some dogs that feel very territorial, so they will bark. That is the worst offense that I've had. I have had dogs come directly up to Henry and they kind of get closer, but generally because I'm there and Henry is pretty much always on a leash outside, they tend not to bother us as much. Actually, I feel like my dog is the aggressor more than the stray dogs. And so my intention is just to kind of get him away relatively quickly. But again, because there are no leash laws, depending on how well trained your dog is, that's something that you could consider doing. You don't necessarily have to leash your dogs, but the more untrained your dog is, the higher the risk that they're going to run onto the street where they might get run over. And some of these stray/outside dogs, they do have a higher chance of getting like fleas or other things, which could affect your pet. All things to consider. There are several parks in Merida, which I think are very open to dogs. But again, most of these parks have no fence, or they've got like a partial fence. So depending on how well trained your dog is, how likely your dog is to stay kind of in the vicinity of you, it might be okay to unleash your dog. Generally, when Henry and I go to a park, the first thing I do is I let him run. I just let him go and I attempt to follow him just to get some of his energy out. But once some of that energy is spent, I do generally put him back on the leash, because I know that once the initial outburst of energy is spent, then his curiosity kicks in and he will just go as far into the woods, as far into the muck as he wants, and I don't necessarily want to follow him down that path. And I find that there's enough people in the world who do not like dogs, even a tiny little dog, so I keep him on a leash. You're definitely not gonna have any trouble finding vets, whether you go with a larger chain like, let's say, Petco or Humanimals, or if you just wanna go to a local vet, they're literally everywhere. I am surrounded by vets of every kind. There are groomers who will come to your house and take care of your dog. There are groomers, of course, that you can take your dog to. People who will come to your house, pick up your dog, take them to the groomers, and then bring them back home all nice and shiny. Affordability when it comes to taking care of your pet here in Merida is, I think, amazing, especially when you compare it to the US. I will note that generally if I'm doing a quick trip back to the US, let's say for 1 week, I generally don't bring the dog. I find it much more costly to transport him over borders, over international borders, and it just feels very not cost effective, as well as it kind of ruins Henry's equilibrium to be flying and such. And so I have a friend watch my dog, as opposed to taking him to, let's say, the US when I do my visa runs, or if I'm taking any kind of overnight trips. Again, I've got somebody local that can watch Henry so that he's not constantly moving around. Anyway, I hope you found that helpful. Let me know if you've got any questions, comments, or concerns below, and I'll be happy to answer.
Stupid, just like the movies. How it's gonna stay in the fight with you. Just thinking we would do this until we couldn't do it. Each and every high, every night with you. You and me so clueless. We were just broken, shattered, singing along to nothing matters. Stray around like nighttime rumors.
Watching this dog play with the bottle is one of my favorite things ever. I just love it.